Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Christian Reeve Podcast. Today's guest is an emotional eating expert and author of Heal Your Hunger, 7 Simple Steps to End Emotional Eating Now. Her name is Tricia Nelson. Welcome to the show, Tricia. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing great.
It's a pleasure to have you. When I told my audience about this, they were pretty excited, naturally, because obviously we all eat, and I straight away when I was looking into your stuff, I was sort of thinking about, various times in my life when I've sort of like done comfort eating and stuff like that. So it's something that we can all kind of relate to.
No question about it.
One thing I wanted to sort of touch on straight away, because I noticed this in your bio, you actually had your own kind of weight loss journey, which is what kind of started all of this, and eventually you sort of going into what you do now. So I kind of wanted to ask you, at what point did you decide to make that change, and how did you go about that change? Like, talk us through that process.
Sure. Yeah, I was really hopeless. I mean, I think as far back as I can remember, I was an emotional eater and very much obsessed with food. Of course, I wasn't aware of being an emotional eater. That's kind of a newish term, and so I just thought I liked food. I like to cook. I like to, prepare food for other people, go out to dinner, the whole 9 yards. But food was a big highlight for me. And so I didn't think a lot about it. But I did think a lot about my weight because I was overweight. And by age 20, I was 50 pounds overweight. And so that was really frustrating to me. And I tried all the diets and pills and potions and lotions and 12-step programs and self-help books. I tried so many things and nothing really gave me, the success I was looking for. I mean, I could lose weight for a period of time, but I'd always gain it back. So I'd like lose 30, then gain 20 of it back, and then lose 10, and then go up 20. I was just all over the map. And I had like 5 different sizes of pants in my closet because I never knew what size I was going to be. So it's very much a yo-yo dieter, and so it was so frustrating. And one day my sister, came home and announced that she was an emotional eater. And I did not like my sister. And so I pretty much discounted everything she said. So I'm like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. But once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And so after that, I started to notice, like, wow, my eating is not normal. Like I'm not exactly like my friends. Like we'd go out to eat and they'd order a sandwich and it would come with fries, and they'd eat their sandwich and pick up their fries. Well, I'd eat my fries and pick up my sandwich. And I'd sit there and think, how could they leave French fries on their plate? That's the best part, And so I started to realize that my eating was different. Like somebody would be having a hot fudge sundae, ice cream with fudge sauce and all this. And they'd like eat part of it, and then they'd push it away and say, oh, I just can't eat anymore. And I'd think, what? Like, what? How could you leave that in the dish? Like, that's crazy. I would never do that. So I started to realize I was not the same as my friends. And so over time, I really noticed that my relationship was very emotional, my relationship with food, and it went way beyond what I needed nutritionally. I was comfort eating a lot. And so that really started to weigh on me, so to speak. And then the weight, of course, was a problem. But I felt very hopeless. And so my turning point came when I had lost quite a lot of weight, and was just about to gain it back. Like that, I had done that so many times. And I was at this point where I thought, you know what, I'm about to go up the scale again. I started to kind of lose control. And I thought, I can't do this for the rest of my life. It's so unhealthy. And it's frustrating because I'm trying. Like, it's not like I'm just sitting around eating bonbons. Like I really am giving it a serious college try here, and nothing's working. So by the grace of God, I met somebody who is a spiritual healer who had been obese and lost the weight. And I was able to show me that my problem really wasn't food or weight. It was a deeper issue. I had to take that deeper journey within and deal with the underlying causes. And that turned everything around for me. And I began to just live this healing path of clearing out the things that were blocking me and making me feel bad about myself, So in the process of cleaning up my eating and getting, really having a whole new relationship with food, I also was having a new relationship with myself. And they go hand in hand. And that's what changed everything for me. And then from that point on, I started working to help others to have the experience I had had. And that's how Heal Your Hunger came about, several decades later. But that's what's resulted in the work that I do with people all around the globe who have emotional eating.
Right. And this is it's this podcast that you host that's centered around this. Like, tell us a little bit more about this podcast and kind of like what is the purpose of it? What's the structure? What can people kind of come to expect each time they listen to it?
Yeah, so the Heal Your Hunger show, which can be found on, most searches for podcast. The Heal Your Hunger show, I've had like over 300 episodes, and there's a balance between my experiences. So I do kind of a riffing show, which is just me talking about the latest aha I've had in my own life and my experience with food, and really my experience with life, because my show is not about diets and calories and, what you should eat, because my experience is anybody who struggles with food and weight is pretty clued in as to what they should and shouldn't be eating. Like salads are typically healthier than pizza, right? Pizza and cookies. So it's not like we're stupid. Like, we get it. We know it's healthy, but the kicker is that we can't follow through on what we know. And so that gap of knowing what to eat, but not being able to follow through, that's really where my show comes in. And I talk about that gap because my experience is it's not really an eating problem as much as it's a living problem, and the way we live, the way we show up in life is creating the stress that we then stress eat over. And so that's really what I talk about is real stuff, emotions, relationships, places of friction in our life that we tend to resort to food to deal with.
I think that with the kind of the crux of the argument that you're proposing, there's a lot that I agree with, but then there's kind of elements that I'm unsure about. Like, I'll give you an example. Like,
sure.
Obviously, there are people out in the world that have low metabolism. So obviously they pick up weight just quicker, and some people have the reverse as well, so they can like never put on weight. I've had friends who've had that issue too. And then of course there's just people that are unfortunately born larger, and they have to work, let's say, like 3-4 times the work in terms of things like exercise and what they eat in order to change the situation. What would you say, like, how does what you do kind of mix with that? Because I feel like with eating, like there is always an emotional relationship with food. It's just the nature of what it is and what it represents for us as human beings. But in those particular instances, like, do you think there's still an emotional link there, or is it just purely like a physical issue that they have to try and overcome?
I think it's rarely just physical.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had a slow metabolism. I gained weight, and into the genetics also. Both my parents were overweight growing up. So I have, this genetics are stacked against me, for sure. And yet I also had this very involved relationship with food that went beyond nutritional. So while there are definitely physical issues, there can be hormonal imbalances, there can be medications that cause weight gain for sure. But typically, even if somebody has some of those imbalances, if it's been a chronic struggle for them, typically there's emotional eating involved as well. And they may not be aware of it. Like, emotional eating is still somewhat of a new concept. So I have people tell me, they're obese and they say, I don't think I'm an emotional eater. What I tell them is, well, it's possible, but what's also possible is you just don't know it because it's working. Like the thing about emotional eating is we eat to numb out, to numb our feelings. And it's effective. Like when we eat carbs and sugar and, high calorie foods, we don't feel as much. And so we're not aware of our feelings, in which case we could be like, emotions, what emotions? But it doesn't mean we're not emotionally eating. So a lot of it's just one's awareness. And that's why I appreciate you having me on the show, because the more people, as I said, you can't unlearn this stuff. It's like once you start to see it, it's really hard to forget it. So, I would just say if somebody is, if it's been a struggle for any length of time, and the yo-yoing is happening, or just, and even, there are like a lot of myths around emotional eating. Like somebody doesn't have to be overweight to be an emotional eater. Like you can still have a very emotional attachment to food and be a normal weight. You just might exercise more or be very controlling around what you eat, but you can still be super tied in on an emotional level with food. Also, like you brought up, you can be somebody who's got a really speedy metabolism or somebody who undereats.
Yeah.
But in my experience, if you're very controlling or restrictive with food, that's emotionally driven as well. Okay. So typically it's like, we're controlling because we're afraid to be out of control, and so that's a thing too. Why are you afraid to be out of control? Well, because I probably would be if I weren't restricting so tightly, and I'm also super obsessed with my weight. Like I'm so scared of getting fat, and that's a thing in and of itself. So I use the words emotional eating as sort of an umbrella, term for disordered eating of any kind. Okay. So when we just have this relationship with food that's involved and, complicated, it's generally, a subset of emotional eating in general. So I don't call them eating disorders because people think bulimia, anorexia, that the extremes, but it doesn't have to be that. And it's really a spectrum. As you said, I think we all comfort eat. I totally agree. I think we're hardwired to have some kind of emotional connection with food. So we will eat, like we can't blow it off. We got to do it. And so I think we're just made to have something, that kicks in where there is some emotional satisfaction from eating as well as the physical nourishment. It's just that some people take it too far. Like I did. I was a binge eater. I could eat 3,000 calories in a sitting. I'd eat ice cream and then cookies, and then you have to have some salty with the sweet. So then I have the chips, and it just kind of went on and on to the point where I felt so sick. I was hating myself and just like, what have I done? Why did I do that? I should have been more careful. Like, what was I thinking? And so that's on the higher end of the spectrum. I was more of a food addict, versus just an emotional eater. So I have a quiz on my website that's free that people can take and find out where they are on that spectrum, because it's definitely a spectrum. We're not all in the same place. Our relationship with food is very individual. Our relationship with food is very similar to our relationship with money. Like we have to have it, like to get on in this world, we have to have it and we have to deal with it and manage it, and sometimes we can get out of control or we can go to the extremes. Like we can be super miserly, and barely spend any money, or we can binge spend, or run ourselves up into debt, and so it's a constant relationship that's growing and changing and flowing, and it's very much indicative of our relationship with ourselves, so both food and money, are very similar in that we have to deal with ourselves and what's going on the inside if we really want to have peace and flow on the outside with these symptoms.
Couldn't agree more with that. This past year and a half I've very much been on that kind of wave, as far as not just with food, but just in general. I think is a good kind of life lesson. But I had a bit of an experience recently, because in what you were just talking about there, I'd probably place myself at the kind of like food addicts thing, like I can be healthy, I know how to eat properly, I know how to be sensible, when to train more, etc. But yeah, I definitely eat a lot. And there's this place that I do volunteering at every Monday, right? And at one point they asked me to help out in the kitchen. And I did it a few times. It was a new thing to me, because I normally help out elsewhere in this place, right? And so naturally, obviously, you cook the food, whatever, and you start dishing it out to people, right? And people obviously pick their portions. Like you're gonna go like, would you like some more, less? Like, what would you like? Blah blah blah, right? And I kind of just started putting out the portions, and like I saw the look on people's faces, like, wow, that's a lot. And I was like, it is? Oh, right. Yeah. Because to me, that's normal. But
right.
Yeah. So
that's fun. I would have done the same thing.
You're right though. It's a hard thing. I mean, I agree with your analysis of it being like a spectrum. I think it's relative for everyone, and you know, we're all so different. You know, like this leads me to my next point actually. So. You in a lot of your studies and everything that you do, you have this kind of 3 meal magic concept that you've sort of referred to in various interviews and stuff. And when I looked into it, it's basically the standard kind of, you know, 3 meals a day, you know, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, however you want to do it, but like sticking to that concept. And I think for many people that can work. I found it doesn't personally work for me. I feel like 2 meals a day seems to work well. I just can't eat breakfast for whatever reason. Don't know why I haven't been able to since a young age. So I guess my question in this is like, can this realistically be applied to everyone, or do we kind of need to figure out our own routines where this is concerned?
Yeah, well, the 3 meal magic plan, which is eating 3 meals with nothing in between, is a very balanced way to eat. And I find I do a lot of networking with kind of cutting edge holistic health practitioners and doctors. And nowadays it really is the trend. You know, it used to be, 6 small meals or whatever, always keep eating. And, you know, that's exhausting, like to be thinking about food all day long.
Yeah.
So nowadays I find that a lot of, you know, sort of forward thinking nutritionists and health gurus are now talking about the 3 meals because it gives your body time to digest.
Right.
You know, we know a lot more about our digestive system and how intelligent it is. And, you know, putting food in and then giving it a rest, you know, and not feeding the funnel, putting food in the funnel is really healthy because it does give your body time to do what it needs to do with that food and, you know, get the nutrients where they need to go and, you know, the waste where it needs to go. So generally just physically it's recommended, but not for everybody. You know, my experience is I'll just finish that thought and just say that for me, it's not the physical as much as it is the emotional, because when we're eating all day, and emotional eaters tend to be snackers. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, nibbling all day long just keeps us numb and unaware of what our feelings are. And so the 3 meal magic for me is a way for people to start tuning into what those emotions are. And if it's hard to heal your hunger if you don't feel some hunger. And so when you feel a little bit of hunger, you also get more in tune with some of the emotions that may be driving your eating. And so it's really more of a tool to begin to have more of an emotional connection with what's going on internally. But I will say that my recommendation to my clients is always that they, first of all, deal with their emotions so they can differentiate between physical and emotional hunger. But also to follow their body's guidance. And I am in no position to tell people what to eat, when to eat, or anything. I'll give you I've been doing this work for over 30 years. I'll give you a recommendation that if you're an emotional eater, probably the easiest plan is going to be the 3 meals because they're an equally spaced out and equally sized meals in general, like the same rough amount of calories per meal. So your body gets used to the same amount of food each mealtime. And then that helps you know when it's physical or emotional hunger as well, because you get used to a certain amount of food. And then you can kind of tell when you're full or still hungry. But that said, ultimately, it's really important that we listen to the wisdom of our divinity, you know, and our bodies, you know, which to me, it's all housed in the same place. Our body temple houses our divine wisdom. And so, spiritually speaking. So my experience, I tell people we all have a divine physician, you know, and the more still and quiet we get, the less activity we have in our life, because overeaters tend to be overdoers. So I certainly recommend slowing down and tuning in. You know, the more we do tune in, though, the more we'll know what's right for our bodies. Now, I do have clients who are on the 2 meal plan when they come to me for help with emotional eating. And I do find that sometimes it's just a distribution issue. Like because they eat 2 meals, they're not hungry for breakfast. Like if you eat a bigger meal at dinner, you're not really going to be hungry for breakfast. So if you kind of change the quantities and start, you know, putting it in 3 different packages, you know, of meals, chances are you can start to develop hunger in the morning. But that's not to say that's your case. You know, you know what's best for your body. And that's really the key in my experience is, you know, not to have the stimuli come from outside of us, but to start to listen inside. So you can read books, you can listen to gurus, get help specifically for emotional eating, which is what I do, obviously, but I always want to defer to people's, divine physician and say, you ultimately know best. You're the one who feels what happens in your body when you eat, and don't eat. And so ultimately it's really about getting a connection with yourself so you can listen more, intently into what's best for you.
What are the most surprising statistics that you've discovered with your studies into emotional eating?
Well, there's not a lot that's surprising to me because I've been an emotional eater for so long and I've been researching this for so long, but surprising to other people, I think, are some of the, the busting of the myths, like the idea that you don't have to be a binger to be an emotional eater. Like people think that's somebody who sits down and eats 3,000 calories like I did, but that's not true. It can be somebody who just is obsessed with food. Like, even though they're very controlled with food, still, if it preoccupies their mind, like they can't stop thinking about food and it takes them out of their present, that can be a sign of emotional eating, or they're just super obsessed with their body. Like they can't let go of their self-criticism around their body. They can't stop thinking there's something wrong with them, and the more we think there's something wrong with us, guess what? The more there is something wrong with us. And so that the feeling of peace around one's body is very elusive when you're an emotional eater, because that plays into the whole thing, all the games we play with food. Also, people, sometimes an emotional eating takes the form of just the food choices that we make. So if we tend to be into the carbs, like we can't stay away from bread, or we're always, if we have a choice of broccoli or potatoes, we eat potatoes. If we have a choice of a banana or an apple, we eat the banana. We eat the heavier, more dense foods, more carb-rich foods, because they serve a purpose of deadening our emotions. So you don't have to be a binger to be an emotional eater. Just some of your choices, if we're choosing those because that makes us feel more grounded and safe, because it's heavier and more dense, that's an emotional choice as well. So there's a lot more to it than just like eating too much or binge eating.
So
yeah.
So I guess, like, in a way, almost what you're saying as well is that, like, in our kind of, how can I put this? When we're trying to become full, to feel full so we have energy and stuff, actually what we're really doing is trying to kind of fill some sort of emotional hole or feel better about ourselves and stuff like that. So there's a deeper, like, whether we believe that or not is kind of what you're saying, it's still the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for having me on, because I think anytime somebody hears this kind of conversation, it's going to drop them deeper, it's going to help. It's at least food for thought, right?
Hey.
So yes, absolutely. And what's also true, another common myth is that it's about the food and the weight. And it really isn't, overweight comes from overeating, and overeating comes from what's eating me. And so I think it's so intuitive that we would just think, if I feel fat or my pants don't fit, I got to do something about my weight. I got to attack it, go get on a diet, get the next fad diet and restrict my eating and exercise a lot, and I'll be good. The problem is it doesn't usually work out that way. So, statistically speaking, 98% of all diets fail. And so that's an abysmal statistic. So if somebody chronically struggles with food and weight and they go on a diet, they're going to gain the weight back if they lose any. They're going to gain it back within, for me, it was weeks. I could diet for a couple of weeks, then I'd be like, Katie, bar the door. Like, I've got to have my sweets, because I was a sugar addict. But in general, the diet mentality of attacking it at the symptom level, the symptom of food and weight, will fail, because, we didn't get overweight just by overeating. It did come from what's eating us. And so that's where we need to drop into in order to have lasting success with weight loss. And so, that's a deeper conversation, but we have to get off the diet track. And so much of what I do is try to get my clients to stop the black and white thinking. This food is good, this food is bad. I did good today. We all have, I did good, I must be doing good. And then boom, next day, we're in the food again. So I try to get people off the diet mentality. I even tell them to throw away their scales. So, or at least hide them somewhere. They can't get to them regularly, because we have to stop focusing on the symptom and start dealing with the real problem, and what is the real problem? In my experience is it's not an eating problem, but a living problem. And what I mean by that is there's certain ways that we are living that create the stress that we stress eat over, and so we have to deal with our stress. We have to look at what's causing the stress and how can we make changes in how we live so we don't end up, with so much stress that we stress eat over. And that, no diet's going to give you that. And diets don't give you tools, replacement tools. I mean, we diet, we take away all our yummy foods and we expect to be happy. Well, what we've taken away is our primary coping tool, and we have to have new coping tools if we're going to stay, with our healthy eating plan. And diets don't give you healthy coping tools, and so that's what we need is we need a new way to deal with our stress, a new way to cope with life's problems, because before food was our, that's what we turned to. So we have to have a new way of coping. And so I always say it's a living problem, not an eating problem. Let's start addressing our living problem and ways to, be healthy around the problems of life.
Would you say that, according to statistics, that women are more prone or men are more prone to emotional eating?
I think it's probably women, certainly women are more aware of it, but I think women, typically we're more emotional.
Okay.
We're more in touch with our emotions. We react to life in a more emotional way versus intellectual, mental way. And we also are more in touch with our emotions typically than men are. Again, I'm generalizing. It's not true for everybody. But yeah. And I also, I think women's bodies, we tend to gain weight very easily. We store more fat. So it's more of a relationship, right? It's more of a rocky relationship, this food thing, with our bodies and gaining weight easily. So I wish more men, there's certainly a huge, obesity issue with men as well as women. So there's no question a lot more men are emotionally eating than they're aware of. And I wish they would, get more hip to it, but it's happening more and more, but it's vital for men and women to start realizing that we are emotional beings, like it or not. And often we're turning to food to stuff those emotions.
Would you say there is a emotional reason for why we tend to feel sick when we're hungry, or is it purely just that our bodies are missing things that we need?
Yeah, I don't know what you mean by sick exactly.
So like, when you haven't eaten for like a long time and you really need to eat kind of thing. And like typically, I think many of us would probably think that's like, well, I need to eat. Yeah, my body's missing certain things.
Yeah, that's natural. Like, of course, we're going to be hungry. that's, when I get hungry, it's been 5 or 6 hours from my last meal, I start to get a little cranky and like, where's the food? So, and I'm on the 3-meal magic plan. So, I don't snack in between. I hold out for my next meal, but, and I do things to help that, some self-care tools that can help lessen my sense of urgency around food. But yeah, I think those are normal signals that our body gives us. Again, so we will eat.
Yeah, so there's no like emotional reason there. It's purely just body driven. I know I kind of felt like silly asking that, but it was
it's okay.
It was a question for one of my followers, and I thought, you know what, there might be something in that. I think that because one of the things I think I've discovered with this conversation is, as you say, there is that kind of deeper link, you know what I mean? Because I think a lot of the time, many of us just dismiss this idea that emotions are attached to eating, except for when we're comfort eating. Like, obviously, we all realize that that's purely emotion because we feel bad. First thing we do, eat to feel better. And we know that consciously. It's the same reason we, you know, some of us drink or some of us have snacks or whatever.
Sure.
It's all tied together.
Yeah. But it's also important to know too, that we do have, you know, I find that emotional eaters do have kind of an internal alarm system. So not only if we haven't eaten for a long period of time, not only are we super hungry and we have the regular hunger signals, but we do often also have kind of an alert system where we might have a deep lying belief. It's kind of primitive that we're going to die if we don't get food. So my feelings around food could be a little more dramatic than your average person, where when I'm super hungry, part of me feels like I will die if I don't eat soon, which is totally irrational. But if you've used food as your primary way of coping in life, like as a kid, we didn't have a lot of options, you know, as kids, you know, for numbing out, for killing pain or dealing with trauma. And so food was right there for us. I mean, you know, you could argue food saved our lives, you know, for emotional eaters that had trauma, especially, you know, when you didn't have ways to deal with the pain and you overate, which I did, you know, it might've saved us. It might've helped us from, you know, jumping off a bridge. So I'm very grateful for food from that standpoint. But I also got that sort of internal cue system that was like, because food was a survival skill for me, overeating, you know, that there's still that underlying belief, kind of primitive belief that, you know, if I don't eat, I'll die.
What's the best way to support a person that's suffering from an eating disorder? So it's not you, it's you know, you see a person, they're in need, you know, what can you do as a friend or a family member?
Yeah, it's very hard. You know, if somebody's not ready to deal with it, they may be touchy and, you know, defensive. And they might have had several people talk to them, in which case they feel alienated. You know, I do recommend my book, my Heal Your Hunger book, which is on Amazon, because it's sometimes a good way to kind of introduce the idea to somebody. Because a lot of people, especially if they're overweight, they've tried so many things to stop overeating, and it's mostly been symptom related. Like they've been doing the diets, they've been doing the weight loss programs, and it hasn't worked because it's symptom related. It doesn't deal with the real problem. So there's a big sense of defeat, and you kind of feel like a loser. Like, wow, everybody seems to lose weight but me, you know, and nothing works for me. So in their mind, it's like to have somebody say, gee, you know, it'd be great if you lost weight. First of all, duh, they're very aware of it, you know, but also part of them may feel like, yeah, I've tried everything. I can't do another diet. Like it's done, like to suggest that I do something about my weight to them means I should go on another diet, but I've tried so many and they haven't worked. So there's sort of a sense of defeat, you know, and hopelessness. And so the good news is there is another way. You don't have to diet in order to lose weight. You can address emotional eating, your relationship with food, you know, lower your stress and have new self-care tools. And boom, in a non-dieting fashion, you can lose weight and keep it off. That's what I teach. So what I recommend is my book to people, because it's sort of a very gentle, you can say, hey, I heard this cool podcast. This guy does these really cool interviews. And I heard this woman talk about her weight struggles, you know, and her journey of healing. It's in this book, you know? And so I've recommended people give that book, and I've had people be very successful with that. Like, this is a really cool idea because it has nothing to do with diets. And I think that's the important thing to say to somebody is like, there is a way to have a healthier relationship with food. And you don't even have to talk about weight loss or weight gain if somebody's underweight. You could just talk about a healthier relationship with food.
Obviously, it's a whole book. It's Heal Your Hunger, 7 Simple Steps to End Emotional Eating Now. We obviously talked about it in the preamble. In your best way of sort of summarizing it, what are these kind of 7 simple steps? Obviously, you've already highlighted it's about addressing that deeper issue, the emotional things that are within us, and addressing that as opposed to addressing the, as you put it, the treating the issue and not the problem.
Yeah.
So
the symptom, not the problem.
It's a symptom. That's the word I was looking for. There you go. But,
yeah. So my process, which is it's laid out in 7 steps for sure. And the nice thing about what I offer people is it's not nebulous. You'll hear around the food conversation words like moderation, just moderate how many sweets you eat. Well, for an emotional eater, that's not so easy. Like I can't just moderate it. Once I eat one, I want to eat a whole lot, right. We hear people talk about intuitive eating. Well, the problem with me is my intuition was off on food because of my emotional life that was dysregulated, and I was using food to cover up. So I would intuit that I should eat way more times than I should, so my intuition was off. So intuitive eating didn't really serve me. And then the idea of mindful eating didn't really serve me, because I could be mindful that I was overeating, but it didn't stop me from overeating. So, and again, those concepts are sound, but put them through the lens of an emotional eater and the experience of an emotional eater, they don't always pan out. So I have a very specific step-by-step process so that people can take the, sort of the woo-woo out of it, the nebulousness out of it, and have very specific steps. So the steps, it would take a long time to go through all of them, but what they are, it's a process of starting to get in tune and in touch, a process of getting centered. So one of the steps is literally centeredness. And in that process is 6 self-care success secrets. And these are ways of bringing down the stress, starting the day by putting money in your spiritual bank account is what I call it. Because our willpower is strongest in the morning, and it wanes, as the day goes on, because we're adding stress to our day. That's why people have trouble at the end of the day or late afternoon, like they're tired, they've got a slump, and they're looking for chocolate or coffee as a quick fix. Well, meditation can help with that, writing, reading, going for a walk, so I have self-care tools for people, but we start first thing in the morning with putting money in our spiritual bank account, with things that can bring down our stress and help us just get centered. When we wake up and we start reacting to the stress of the day, the emails, the text, the Instagram, all of a sudden we're just ricocheting off of one demand and the next. And it's really important to start the day getting still and quiet and centered, like tapping in and tuning in with our divine self, and then we can go through the day drawing on, the money we put in that spiritual bank account. So later in the day, we can draw from that resource, because when we're out of resources, we turn to food, for quick energy. That's just what we depend on. And we have to develop these self-care tools. And so that's a big part of what I teach. I also teach communication skills, because emotional eaters tend to eat their words. Okay. They tend to be afraid of saying how they feel about something. And so I really teach them how to start speaking up, because they don't know. Like, we're such emotional eaters or people pleasers, so we want everybody to like us. And so it's hard for us to speak up for ourselves. It's hard to say, no, that's not okay, or no, that doesn't work for me, or I'd rather go to this restaurant instead of that one, because it's a lot less greasy. It's a cleaner place to eat. Like, even saying our choice of restaurant sometimes can be hard. Like, standing for ourselves, typically our self-esteem has been pretty battered, growing up with a weight problem, let's say, or just feeling different in some way. And so having the self-esteem to stand for our choices and our preferences is not easy. So there's a lot of that involved. There's community. My programs are all about connecting in community. And I have a free Facebook group that's private, that people can connect with other emotional eaters. So community is very important as well, because emotional eaters tend to think they're the only ones who've done the crazy things they've done with food. Like, honestly, when I binged, I'd be done. Like I couldn't possibly eat anymore. And I tried vomiting, that didn't work. So thank God. So I would just stuff myself, and then I'd feel so gross that I'd throw the rest of the food out when I just couldn't possibly eat another bite. I'd throw the rest of the food out. But later, Christian, I would go back and I'd dig out those cookies that I knew were there. And I'd be like, oh my God, like I just ate food from the trash. Like, how bad am I? But turns out lots of emotional eaters have done crazy stuff. Like I even had people giving me tips, like, cause I did the YouTube video on that once.
Hey, here's something you haven't figured out. Try this one.
Yeah, they're like, oh, I put coffee grounds. After I throw the food out, I put coffee grounds or I dishwashing soap on it, so I can't possibly go back and get it. I'm like, well, I never thought of that. So, clearly we're not the only ones who've done these crazy things. So when we get in community with other people who have this problem, oh my God, it takes so much the shame out of it, the isolation out of it. It enables us to really start to, feel to be on a healing path and feel like we're not so bad after all. We're just, we're not bad getting good. We're unwell getting well. And so that helps so much. So those are a few of the steps, in my process.
Thank you for sharing. What do you think are some of the best kind of resources out there then for emotional eaters right now? Like what's a good place to start? I mean, obviously, yeah, they can read your book. They can obviously take certain steps with their current diet. But, obviously you mentioned that there's a community element. And I think that is always much more, well, just better in general when there's other people who understand your struggle, who are right there with you. So yeah, what are the best resources out there?
Well, my private group on Facebook is called The Secret Sauce to End Emotional Eating. And so I certainly recommend people check out that. I also have a really active Instagram feed with really cool posts, and that's at Tricia Nelson _ is at the end of the word Nelson. So it's Tricia Nelson _, and that's really supportive. And then my podcast as well, for sure. And my book, as I mentioned, but I do have programs if people really want to like fast track their results. I do offer programs, specifically for people to join up with a community of people who are going through my step-by-step process. So I offer that as well. It's just really important to not try to do it alone, and to not try to figure it out on your own either, because people are so ashamed of getting help with their food issue. But, hiring a coach is not a shameful thing. And people who are, wanting to excel in sports, our tennis players, our tennis stars. I mean, they have one coach, if not two coaches, people in business, CEOs, they have business coaches, trainers. If we want to learn how to work out right, we're going to get a trainer, but when it comes to food, it's like, oh no, I got it, I'll figure it out on my own. Well, really? Like, how long have you been struggling with this thing? So chances are you don't know how to do it. Get help. It's just, don't make it so hard on yourself, because that, reaching out for help is one of the best steps you can take. And also, I just want to mention that I had spoken of my quiz earlier, and that's a great first step for people, is to take that quiz and find out where they are on the emotional eating spectrum, and that's at healyourhunger.com.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really positive way of looking at it, actually. I think I suppose the biggest thing that affects us generally with eating, overeating, binge eating, whatever the case may be, is that feeling of guilt. But yeah, if you start to look at it more practically, it makes sense. I mean, yeah, obviously the richest in society tend to have a nutritionist or something like that, which isn't really that dissimilar from a coach or whatever. It's basically just someone informing you, hey, you should consider this, you should consider this. A consultant, we got all sorts of people like that in our lives for various things. So yeah, it makes sense that we would have that for what we eat.
And the thing is, to take the shame out of it even more, is that food is the hardest of all addictive habits to overcome, because we have to eat. We have to eat 3 times a day. If you're an alcoholic, you put the plug in the jug and you get it out of your house. But food, you can't do that with. And so it's very complicated. Plus, we usually started using food as a coping tool a lot earlier than we did alcohol or drugs or something like that. So it's really important to realize that, it is so tricky, because I always say with food, you have to take the tiger out of the cage, pet the kitty 3 times a day, and put it back in the cage without getting your ass torn off. So that's tricky. That's tricky business. So you might want to get support for that.
Excellent. I'm going to flip it up and ask you something totally unrelated to emotional eating. I asked every guest of mine this question, and I always get a unique response. What's the biggest life lesson that you've learned so far?
I would say that I have to get in touch with my emotions and address my emotions if I expect to have a successful life. Like, I can't ignore them. I used to think, Christian, that there was something wrong with me because I had emotions. I thought, normal people don't have emotions. They just are mental and physical. And this is way back when I was a kid. But then I realized, no, emotion, like God made us to have emotions for a reason, and to realize that to be a fully, thriving human being, I need to really be integrated with my emotions and emotionally balanced, which I was not. So I've learned how to become emotionally balanced, but not to deny that part of myself, not to think there's something wrong with me if I have an emotional response to something. That's part of being human, and the more I can, stop stuffing my emotions and be more awake to my experience of life, the healthier I'm actually going to be.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I just want to say a massive thank you for agreeing to be on the show. My final question to you is, do you have any upcoming projects or some final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I do something called the Quit Sugar Challenge quarterly. So if somebody kind of wants to get sugar out of their life, I have a really cool 5-day Quit Sugar Challenge that they can do if that's something that speaks to them. And the website for that, you can sign up if it's not happening right away, because this is a podcast. You can sign up to get notified when it is coming up, and that's at quitsugarchallenge.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. And massive thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. You're a great host. So thanks for the talk.
Thank you. And to all my listeners of the Christian Reeve Podcast, thank you very much for listening. Be safe, be well. Until next time, peace out, one love. I'll see you in the next one.